Adolf Hitler. Leader of the Nazi Party from 1920. And Chancellor and Fuhrer of Germany 1933–45. Unique in Germany at the time. Unremitting propaganda, set against the failure of the government to improve conditions during the Depression, produced a steadily mounting electoral strength for the Nazis. The party became the second largest in the country, rising from 2.6% of the vote in the national election of 1928 to more than 18% in September 1930. In 1932, Hitler opposed Hindenburg in the presidential election, capturing 36.8% of the votes on the second ballot. Finding himself in a strong position by virtue of his unprecedented mass following, he entered into a series of intrigues with conservatives such as Franz von Papen, Otto Meissner, and President Hindenburg's son, Oskar. The fear of communism and the rejection of the Social Democrats bound them together. In spite of a decline in the Nazi Party's votes in November 1932, Hitler insisted that the chancellorship was the only office he would accept. On January 30, 1933, Hindenburg offered him the chancellorship of Germany. His cabinet included few Nazis at that point. Hitler's personal life had grown more relaxed and stable with the added comfort that accompanied political success. After his release from prison, he often went to live on the Obersalzberg, near Berchtesgaden. His income at this time was derived from party funds and from writing for nationalist newspapers. He was largely indifferent to clothes and food but did not eat meat and gave up drinking beer and all other alcohols. His rather irregular working schedule prevailed. He usually rose late, sometimes dawdled at his desk, and retired late at night. At Berchtesgaden, his half-sister Angela Raubel and her two daughters accompanied him. Hitler became devoted to one of them, Jelly, and it seems that his possessive jealousy drove her to suicide in September 1931. 4 weeks Hitler was inconsolable. Sometime later, Eva Braun, a shop assistant from Munich, became his mistress. Hitler rarely allowed her to appear in public with him. He would not consider marriage on the grounds that it would hamper his career. Braun was a simple young woman with few intellectual gifts. Her great virtue in Hitler's eyes was her unquestioning loyalty, and in recognition of this, he legally married her at the end of his life. Once in power, Hitler established an absolute dictatorship. He secured the president's assent for new elections. The Reichstag fire on the night of February 27, 1933, apparently the work of a Dutch communist, Marinus van der Lubbe, provided an excuse for a decree overriding all guarantees of freedom, and for an intensified campaign of violence. In these conditions, when the elections were held, March 5, the Nazis polled 43.9% of the votes. On March 21, the Reichstag assembled in the Potsdam Garrison Church to demonstrate the unity of National Socialism with the old conservative Germany, represented by Hindenburg. 2 days later, the enabling bill, giving full powers to Hitler, was passed in the Reichstag by the combined votes of Nazi, Nationalist, and Center Party deputies, March 23, 1933. Less than 3 months later, all non-Nazi parties, organizations, and labor unions ceased to exist. The disappearance of the Catholic Center Party was followed by a German concordat with the Vatican in July. Hitler had no desire to spark a radical revolution. Conservative ideas were still necessary if he was to succeed to the presidency and retain the support of the army. Moreover, he did not intend to expropriate the leaders of industry, provided they served the interests of the Nazi state. Ernst Röhm, however, was a protagonist of the continuing revolution. He was also, as head of the SA, distrusted by the army. Hitler tried first to secure Röhm's support for his policies by persuasion. Hermann Göring and Heinrich Himmler were eager to remove Röhm, but Hitler hesitated until the last moment. Finally, on June 29, 1934, he reached his decision. On the night of the Long Knives, Röhm and his lieutenant, Edmund Heinz, were executed without trial, along with Gregor Strasser, Kurt von Schleicher, and others. The army leaders, satisfied at seeing the SA broken up, approved Hitler's actions. When Hindenburg died on August 2nd, the army leaders, together with Papen, assented to the merging of the chancellorship and the presidency, with which went the supreme command of the armed forces of the Reich. Now officers and men took an oath of allegiance to Hitler personally. Economic recovery and a fast reduction in unemployment made the regime increasingly popular, and a combination of success and police terror brought the support of 90% of the voters in a plebiscite. Hitler devoted little attention to the organization and running of the domestic affairs of the Nazi state. Responsible for the broad lines of policy as well as for the system of terror that upheld the state, he left detailed administration to his subordinates. Each of these exercised arbitrary power in his own sphere, but by deliberately creating offices and organizations with overlapping authority, Hitler effectively prevented any one of these particular realms from ever becoming sufficiently strong to challenge his own absolute authority. Foreign policy claimed his greater interest. As he had made clear in Mein Kampf, the reunion of the German peoples was his overriding ambition. Beyond that, the natural field of expansion lay eastward, in Poland, the Ukraine, and the USSR, expansion that would necessarily involve renewal of Germany's historic conflict with the Slavic peoples, who would be subordinate in the new order to the Teutonic master race. He saw fascist Italy as his natural ally in this crusade. Britain was a possible ally, provided that it would abandon its traditional policy of maintaining the balance of power in Europe and limit itself to its interests overseas. In the West, France remained the natural enemy of Germany and must, therefore, be cowed or subdued to make expansion eastward possible. Before such expansion was possible, it was necessary to remove the restrictions placed on Germany at the end of World War I by the Treaty of Versailles. Hitler used all the arts of propaganda to allay the suspicions of the other powers. He posed as the champion of Europe against the scourge of Bolshevism, and insisted that he was a man of peace who wished only to remove the inequalities of the Versailles Treaty. He withdrew from the Disarmament Conference and from the League of Nations, October 1933, and he signed a non-aggression treaty with Poland, January 1934. Every repudiation of the treaty was followed by an offer to negotiate a fresh agreement and insistence on the limited nature of Germany's ambitions. Only once did the Nazis overreach themselves, when Austrian Nazis, with the connivance of German organizations, murdered Chancellor Engelbert Dollfuss of Austria and attempted a revolt, July 1934. The attempt failed, and Hitler disclaimed all responsibility. In January 1935, a plebiscite in the Saarland, with a more than 90% majority, returned that territory to Germany. In March of the same year, Hitler introduced conscription. Although this action provoked protests from Britain, France, and Italy, the opposition was restrained, and Hitler's peace diplomacy was sufficiently successful to persuade the British to negotiate a naval treaty, June 1935, recognizing Germany's right to a considerable navy. His greatest stroke came in March 1936, when he used the excuse of a pact between France and the Soviet Union to march into the demilitarized Rhineland, a decision that he took against the advice of many generals. Meanwhile, the alliance with Italy, foreseen in Mein Kampf, rapidly became a reality as a result of the sanctions imposed by Britain and France against Italy during the Ethiopian War. In October 1936, a Rome-Berlin axis was proclaimed by Italian dictator Benito Mussolini. Shortly afterward came the Anti-Comintern Pact with Japan, and a year later all three countries joined in a pact. Although on paper France had a number of allies in Europe, while Germany had none, Hitler's Third Reich had become the principal European power. In November 1937, at a secret meeting of his military leaders, Hitler outlined his plans for future conquest, beginning with Austria and Czechoslovakia. In January 1938, he dispensed with the services of those who were not wholehearted in their acceptance of Nazi dynamism, Hjalmar Schacht, who was concerned with the German economy, Werner von Fritsch, a representative of the caution of professional soldiers, and Konstantin von Neurath, Hindenburg's appointment at the Foreign Office. In February, Hitler invited the Austrian Chancellor, Kurt von Schuschnigg, to Berchtesgaden and forced him to sign an agreement including Austrian Nazis within the Vienna government. When Schuschnigg attempted to resist, announcing a plebiscite about Austrian independence, Hitler immediately ordered the invasion of Austria by German troops. The enthusiastic reception that Hitler received convinced him to settle the future of Austria by outright annexation, Anschluss. He returned in triumph to Vienna, the scene of his youthful humiliations and hardships. No resistance was encountered from Britain and France. Hitler had taken special care to secure the support of Italy. As this was forthcoming, he proclaimed his undying gratitude to Mussolini. In spite of his assurances that Anschluss would not affect Germany's relations with Czechoslovakia, Hitler proceeded at once with his plans against that country. Konrad Henlein, leader of the German minority in Czechoslovakia, was instructed to agitate for impossible demands on the part of the Sudetenland Germans, thereby enabling Hitler to move ahead on the dismemberment of Czechoslovakia. Britain's and France's willingness to accept the cession of the Sudetenland areas to Germany presented Hitler with the choice between substantial gains by peaceful agreement or by a spectacular war against Czechoslovakia. The intervention by Mussolini and British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain appear to have been decisive. Hitler accepted the Munich Agreement on September 30th. He also declared that these were his last territorial demands in Europe. Only a few months later, he proceeded to occupy the rest of Czechoslovakia. On March 15, 1939, he marched into Prague declaring that the rest of Czechia would become a German protectorate. A few days later, March 23, the Lithuanian government was forced to cede Memel, Klaipėda, next to the northern frontier of East Prussia, to Germany. Immediately Hitler turned on Poland. Confronted by the Polish nation and its leaders, whose resolution to resist him was strengthened by a guarantee from Britain and France, Hitler confirmed his alliance with Italy, the Pact of Steel, May 1939. Moreover, on August 23, just within the deadline set for an attack on Poland, he signed a non-aggression pact with Joseph Stalin's Soviet Union, the greatest diplomatic bombshell in centuries. Hitler still disclaimed any quarrel with Britain, but to no avail. The German invasion of Poland, September 1, was followed 2 days later by a British and French declaration of war on Germany. In his foreign policy, Hitler combined opportunism and clever timing. He showed astonishing skill in judging the mood of the democratic leaders and exploiting their weaknesses, in spite of the fact that he had scarcely set foot outside Austria and Germany and spoke no foreign language. Up to this point, every move had been successful. Even his anxiety over British and French entry into the war was dispelled by the rapid success of the campaign in Poland. He could, he thought, rely on his talents during the war as he relied on them before. Germany's war strategy was assumed by Hitler from the first. When the successful campaign against Poland failed to produce the desired peace accord with Britain, he ordered the army to prepare for an immediate offensive in the west. Bad weather made some of his reluctant generals postpone the western offensive. This in turn led to two major changes in planning. The first was Hitler's order to forestall an eventual British presence in Norway by occupying that country and Denmark in April 1940. Hitler took a close personal interest in this daring operation. From this time onward, his intervention in the detail of military operations grew steadily greater. The second was Hitler's important adoption of General Erich von Manstein's plan for an attack through the Ardennes, which began May 10th, instead of farther north. This was a brilliant and startling success. The German armies reached the Channel ports, which they had been unable to reach during World War I, in 10 days. Holland surrendered after 4 days and Belgium after 16 days. Hitler held back General Gerd von Rundstedt's tanks south of Dunkirk, thus enabling the British to evacuate most of their army, but the Western campaign as a whole was amazingly successful. On June 10, Italy entered the war on the side of Germany. On June 22, Hitler signed a triumphant armistice with the French on the site of the Armistice of 1918. Hitler hoped that the British would negotiate an armistice. When this did not happen, he proceeded to plan the invasion of Britain, together with the elimination of British air power. At the same time, preparations were begun for the invasion of the Soviet Union, which in Hitler's view was Britain's last hope for a bulwark against German control of the continent. Then Mussolini invaded Greece, where the failures of the Italian armies made it necessary for German forces to come to their aid in the Balkans and North Africa. Hitler's plans were further disrupted by a coup d'état in Yugoslavia in March 1941, overthrowing the government that had made an agreement with Germany. Hitler immediately ordered his armies to subdue Yugoslavia. The campaigns in the Mediterranean theater, although successful, were limited compared to the invasion of Russia. Hitler would spare few forces from Operation Barbarossa, the planned invasion of the Soviet Union. The attack against the USSR was launched on June 22, 1941. The German army advanced swiftly into the Soviet Union, corralling almost 3 million Russian prisoners, but it failed to destroy its Russian opponent. Hitler became overbearing in his relations with his generals. He disagreed with them about the object of the main attack, and he wasted time and strength by failing to concentrate on a single objective. In December 1941, a few miles before Moscow, a Russian counteroffensive finally made it clear that Hitler's hopes of a single campaign could not be realized. On December 7th, the next day, the Japanese attacked U.S. forces at Pearl Harbor. Hitler's alliance with Japan forced him to declare war on the United States. From this moment on, his entire strategy changed. He hoped and tried, like his idol Frederick II the Great, to break what he deemed was the unnatural coalition of his opponents by forcing one or the other of them to make peace. In the end, the unnatural coalition between Stalin and Winston Churchill and Franklin D. Roosevelt did break up, but too late for Hitler. He also ordered the reorganization of the German economy on a full wartime basis. Meanwhile, Himmler prepared the ground for a new order in Europe. From 1933 to 1939, and in some instances even during the first years of the war, Hitler's purpose was to expel the Jews from the Greater German Reich. In 1941, this policy changed from expulsion to extermination. The concentration camps created under the Nazi regime were thereby expanded to include extermination camps, such as Auschwitz, and mobile extermination squads, the Einsatzgruppen. Although Catholics, Poles, homosexuals, Roma, Gypsies, and the handicapped were targeted for persecution, if not outright extermination, the Jews of Germany, Poland, and the Soviet Union were by far the most numerous among the victims. In German-occupied Europe, some 6 million Jews were killed during the war. The sufferings of other peoples were only less when measured in their numbers killed. At the end of 1942, defeat at El Alamein and at Stalingrad and the American landing in French North Africa brought the turning point in the war, and Hitler's character and way of life began to change. Directing operations from his headquarters in the east, he refused to visit bombed cities or to allow some withdrawals, and he became increasingly dependent on his physician, Theodor Morell, and on the large amounts and varieties of medicines he ingested. Yet Hitler had not lost the power to react vigorously in the face of misfortune. After the arrest of Mussolini in July 1943 and the Italian armistice, he not only directed the occupation of all important positions held by the Italian army but also ordered the rescue of Mussolini, with the intention that he should head a new fascist government. On the Eastern Front, however, there was less and less possibility of holding up the advance. Relations with his army commanders grew strained, the more so with the growing importance given to the SS Schutzstaffel divisions. Meanwhile, the general failure of the U-boat campaign and the bombing of Germany made chances of German victory very unlikely. Desperate officers and anti-Nazi civilians became ready to remove Hitler and negotiate a peace. Several attempts on Hitler's life were planned in 1943 to 44. The most nearly successful was made on July 20, 1944, when Colonel Klaus von Stauffenberg exploded a bomb at a conference being held at Hitler's headquarters in East Prussia. But Hitler escaped with superficial injuries, and with few exceptions, those implicated in the plot were executed. The reduction of the army's independence was now made complete. National Socialist political officers were appointed to all military headquarters. Thereafter, Hitler was increasingly ill, but he did not relax or lose control, and he continued to exercise an almost hypnotic power over his close subordinates, none of whom wielded any independent authority. The Allied invasion of Normandy, June 6, 1944, marked the beginning of the end. Within a few months, 8 European capitals, Rome, Paris, Brussels, Bucharest, Sofia, Athens, Belgrade, Helsinki, were liberated by the Allies or surrendered to them. In December 1944, Hitler moved his headquarters to the west to direct an offensive in the Ardennes aimed at splitting the American and the British armies. When this failed, his hopes for victory became ever more visionary. Based on the use of new weapons, German rockets had been fired on London since June 1944, or on the breakup of the Allied powers. After January 1945, Hitler never left the Chancellery in Berlin or its bunker, abandoning a plan to lead a final resistance in the south as the Soviet forces closed in on Berlin. In a state of extreme nervous exhaustion, he at last accepted the inevitability of defeat and thereupon prepared to take his own life, leaving to its fate the country over which he had taken absolute command. Before this, 2 further acts remained. At midnight on April 28 to 29, he married Eva Braun. Immediately afterward, he dictated his political testament, justifying his career and appointing Admiral Karl Donitz as head of the state and Joseph Goebbels as chancellor. On April 30th, he said farewell to Goebbels and the few others remaining, then retired to his suite and shot himself. His wife took poison. In accordance with his instructions, their bodies were burned. Hitler's success was due to the susceptibility of post-war Germany to his unique talents as a national leader. His rise to power was not inevitable, yet there was no one who equaled his ability to exploit and shape events to his own ends. The power that he wielded was unprecedented, both in its scope and in the technical resources at its command. His ideas and purposes were accepted in whole or in part by millions of people, especially in Germany but also elsewhere. By the time he was defeated, he had destroyed most of what was left of old Europe, while the German people had to face what they would later call Year Zero, 1945. Hitler's place in history. At the turn of the 21st century, more books had been written about Hitler since his death than about Napoleon during the half-century after the latter's demise. Time and distance from the events of World War II have also affected the historical interpretation of Hitler. There is a general consensus about his historical importance, a term that does not imply a positive judgment. Hitler was principally and alone responsible for starting World War II. This was different from the various responsibilities of rulers and of statesmen who had unleashed World War I. His guilt for the implementation of the Holocaust, that is, the shift of German policy from the expulsion to the extermination of Jews, including eventually Jews of all of Europe and of European Russia, is also obvious. Although there exists no single document of his order to that effect, Hitler's speeches, writings, reports of discussions with associates and foreign statesmen, and testimony by those who carried out the actions have often been cited as evidence of his role. Many of his most violent statements were recorded by his minions during his table talks, including the not entirely authentic Bormann remarks of February-April 1945. For example, on January 30, 1939, to celebrate the 6th anniversary of his rule, Hitler told the Reichstag, "Today I will once more be a prophet. If the international Jewish financiers in and outside Europe should succeed in plunging the nations once more in a world war, then the result will not be the Bolshevization of the earth and thus the victory of Jewry, but the annihilation of the Jewish race in Europe." In his final will and testament, written just before his suicide in April 1945, he charged the Germans to continue the struggle against the Jews. "Above all, I enjoin the government and the people to uphold the race laws to the limit and to resist mercilessly the poisoner of all nations, international Jewry." Despite the immense mass of surviving German documents and the large volume of his recorded speeches and other statements, Hitler was, as he himself said on a few occasions, a secretive man, and some of his views and decisions differed at times from his public expressions. For a long time, historians and other commentators took it for granted that Hitler's wishes and ambitions and ideology were clearly and frighteningly set forth in Mein Kampf. In the first autobiographical portion of Mein Kampf, however, he twisted the truth in at least 3 matters. His relationship to his father, which was very different from the filial affection he had set forth in Mein Kampf. The conditions of his life in Vienna, which were less marked by abject poverty than he had stated, and the crystallization of his worldview, including his anti-Semitism, during his Vienna years. The evidence now suggests that this crystallization occurred much later, in Munich. The popular view of Hitler often involves assumptions about his mental health. There has been a tendency to attribute madness to Hitler. Despite the occasional evidences of his furious outbursts, Hitler's cruelties and his most extreme expressions and orders suggest a cold brutality that was fully conscious. The attribution of madness to Hitler would of course absolve him from his responsibility for his deeds and words, as it also absolves the responsibility of those who are unwilling to think further about him. Extensive researches of his medical records also indicate that, at least until the last 10 months of his life, he was not profoundly handicapped by illness, except for advancing symptoms of Parkinson's disease. What is indisputable is that Hitler had a certain tendency to hypochondria, that he ingested vast amounts of medications during the war, and that as early as 1938 he convinced himself that he would not live long, which may have been a reason for speeding up his timetable for conquest at that time. It should also be noted that Hitler possessed mental abilities that were denied by some of his earlier critics. These included an astonishing memory for certain details and an instinctive insight into his opponent's weaknesses. Again, these talents increase, rather than diminish, his responsibility for the many brutal and evil actions he ordered and committed. His most amazing achievement was his uniting the great mass of the German and Austrian people behind him. Throughout his career, his popularity was larger and deeper than the popularity of the National Socialist Party. A great majority of Germans believed in him until the very end. In this respect, he stands out among almost all of the dictators of the 19th and 20th centuries, which is especially impressive when we consider that the Germans were among the best educated peoples in the 20th century. There is no question that the overwhelming majority of the German people supported Hitler, though often only passively. Their trust in him was greater than their trust in the Nazi hierarchy. Of course, what contributed to this support were the economic and social successes, for which he fully took credit, during his early leadership. The virtual disappearance of unemployment, the rising prosperity of the masses, the new social institutions, and the increase of German prestige in the 1930s, achievements unparalleled in the histories of other modern totalitarian dictatorships. In spite of the spiritual and intellectual progenitors of some of his ideas, there is no German national leader to whom he may be compared. In sum, he had no forerunners. another difference between him and other dictators. By 1938, Hitler had made Germany the most powerful and feared country in Europe and perhaps in the world. He achieved all of this without war, and there are now some historians who state that had he died in 1938 before the mass executions began, he would have gone down in history as the greatest statesman in the history of the German people. In fact, he came very close to winning the war in 1940, but the resistance of Britain, personified by Winston Churchill, thwarted him. Nevertheless, it took the overwhelming and in many ways unusual Anglo-American coalition with the Soviet Union to defeat the Third Reich, and there are reasons to believe that neither side would have been able to conquer him alone. At the same time, it was his brutality and some of his decisions that led to his destruction, binding the unusual alliance of capitalists and communists, of Churchill and Roosevelt and Stalin together. Hitler thought he was a great statesman, but he did not realize the unconditional contemptibility of what he had unleashed. He thought that the coalition of his enemies would eventually break up, and then he would be able to settle with one side or the other. In thinking thus, he deceived himself, though such wishes and hopes were also current among many Germans until the end. Open and hidden admirers of Hitler continue to exist, and not only in Germany, some of them because of a malign attraction to the efficacy of evil, others because of their admiration of Hitler's achievements, no matter how transitory or brutal. However, because of the brutalities and the very crimes associated with his name, it is not likely that Hitler's reputation as the incarnation of evil will ever change. Do you learn a lot? Don't forget to like and subscribe to this channel so you can get more videos like this. Until next time.